A waitress stepped in to defend an elderly woman being humiliated at the luxury restaurant where she worked, never knowing the woman was a secret millionaire. What the woman did next left everyone speechless and changed the waitress's life in ways she never could have imagined. Hello friends. Welcome to today's story. Before we go any further, please like this video and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Are you in London, Houston, Toronto, maybe South Africa or Jamaica? We love hearing from you. Now sit back, get comfortable, and let's get into this story. Because this one will stay with you. The rain started just before 7 o'clock. It came down hard and mean, the kind of rain that does not care about your plans or your good clothes or the fact that you have been on your feet since 5 in the morning. It hammered the pavements and bounced off car rooftops and ran down the sides of buildings in small rivers that disappeared into the gutters below. The wind came with it too, bending the trees along the sidewalk and turning every umbrella inside out. People ran. They pulled their coats tight and ducked their heads and moved as fast as their legs could carry them, trying to get somewhere warm and dry before the rain soaked through to their skin. But on one particular corner of the most expensive street in the whole city, there was a place where the rain did not matter at all. Golden Ember sat on that corner like a crown jewel, glowing warm and golden against the dark and stormy night. It was the kind of restaurant that did not need to advertise itself, because everyone who mattered already knew it was there. The building was tall and elegant, with long windows that stretched nearly from the floor all the way up to the ceiling, and through those windows you could see everything inside, the dozens of chandeliers hanging overhead, each one dripping with crystal that caught the light and threw it in every direction like tiny stars. You could see the white tablecloths, pressed so perfectly flat and smooth that they looked like they had been ironed just seconds before each guest sat down. You could see the polished marble floors that shone so brightly they reflected the faces of the people walking across them. And you could see the guests themselves, men in dark suits and women in dresses that cost more than most people earned in a month, sitting together at round tables, laughing quietly, raising crystal glasses filled with expensive wine, and speaking in the low, careful voices of people who believe that the whole world is listening. A man in a perfectly fitted black suit stood outside under the gold awning at the front entrance, opening the heavy glass door for every guest who arrived. Black cars pulled up one after another, and out stepped politicians with their careful smiles, celebrities with their careful faces, and businessmen with their careful handshakes. Each one walked through those doors and was immediately swallowed by the warm orange light and the soft sound of the grand piano that sat in the corner of the main dining room, played every evening by a man in a white jacket who never looked up from the keys. Golden Ember was not a restaurant for ordinary people. Everyone understood that without being told. The prices on the menu were enough to make that clear. A single plate of food at Golden Ember could cost a working person an entire week of wages. The cheapest glass of water came in a crystal bottle that cost $12. Nobody questioned this. Nobody complained. Because the people who ate at Golden Ember did not think about prices. They thought about being seen. They thought about being in the right place at the right table with the right people around them. Golden Ember was not just a restaurant. It was a symbol. It said without using a single word, I have arrived. I am important. I belong here. But behind the beautiful chandeliers and the piano music and the polished floors, there was another world entirely. A world that the guests never saw and never thought about. Behind the swinging kitchen doors, there were people who arrived before sunrise and left long after midnight. People who carried heavy trays and smiled through tired feet and aching backs and empty stomachs. People whose own lives were full of problems and struggles and worries that they quietly set aside each evening when they put on their uniforms and walked out onto that shining floor to serve the people who sat at those perfect white tables. Among those people was a young woman named Naomi Carter. Naomi was 23 years old, and she had been working at Golden Ember for almost 2 years. She was tall and lean, with warm brown eyes that always seemed to be paying attention, noticing things that other people missed. She wore her hair pulled back neatly under a small clip because the manager required it, and her uniform, a crisp white shirt tucked into black trousers, was always clean and pressed, even on the mornings when she had barely slept. She moved through the dining room with a kind of quiet grace that the regular customers had stopped noticing long ago, because to them she was not really a person. She was just the hands that brought their food and refilled their glasses and cleared away their plates when they were finished. But Naomi Carter was very much a person. And her life outside those golden walls was harder than most people could imagine. She lived in a small apartment on the other side of the city, far from the glittering streets of the downtown area. The apartment had 2 rooms. In one of them she slept. In the other, her younger brother Marcus slept when he could sleep at all. Marcus was 19 years old, and for the past 8 months he had been sick. Not the kind of sick where you rest for a few days and feel better. The kind of sick that required hospital visits and medication and special treatments that cost money Naomi did not have. The doctors used long words she had to look up on her phone to understand, and every time she looked them up, she felt a cold weight settle in her chest that stayed there all day. She worked double shifts almost every day. She woke up before the sun, made Marcus his breakfast, made sure he had taken his medicine, and then took the bus across the city to be at Golden Ember by the time the lunch service began. She worked through lunch and straight into the dinner rush without stopping, sometimes grabbing half a bread roll in the kitchen between orders when the manager was not looking. By the time she got home each night, Marcus was usually already asleep, and she would sit at the small kitchen table and count what was left of her pay after rent and medication and groceries, and the numbers were almost always too small. Almost always not enough. But she never gave up. She never stopped showing up. And no matter how tired she was or how heavy the weight on her shoulders felt, she never stopped being kind. That was the thing about Naomi Carter that set her apart from almost everyone else in that restaurant. Her kindness was not the fake, careful kind that people perform when they want something in return. It was real. It was the kind of kindness that cost you something. She remembered the names of regular customers' children. She brought extra bread to the table when she could see someone looked hungry. She covered for her co-workers when they needed a moment to breathe, even when it meant more work for herself. She did these things quietly without announcement, because to her they were simply the right thing to do. She had grown up with very little, and she understood in her bones what it felt like to be overlooked and underestimated and treated as if you did not matter. So she made sure that no one who sat at her tables ever felt that way. The evening of the storm started like every other busy Thursday evening at Golden Ember. Every table was full. The kitchen was loud and hot and frantic behind the closed doors. The piano played something quiet and slow that nobody in the dining room was actually listening to. Naomi moved between the tables with her notepad and her tray, taking orders, delivering plates, smiling at people who rarely smiled back, and trying very hard not to think about the fact that her feet had been hurting since 3 in the afternoon. She was refilling a water glass at table 7 when she heard it. A hush. Not the natural pause between conversations. Something different. Something that started at the front of the restaurant and moved slowly backward through the room, like a wave, until it had reached every single table and every single person in the dining room had gone quiet. Naomi looked up. The front door was open. Standing in the doorway completely still was an elderly woman. She was small and thin, and the rain had clearly been unkind to her. Her gray hair, which might have been neatly arranged before the storm, was now slightly flattened and damp around her temples. Her coat was old, the kind of coat that had once been a good coat many years ago, dark green with large buttons, but now the color had faded and the fabric was thin at the elbows and the hem had come loose on one side and hung a little lower than the other. Her shoes were soaked completely through, and as she stepped fully inside the restaurant and let the door fall gently closed behind her, she left small wet footprints on the polished marble floor. She was carrying an old handbag, brown leather, cracked and worn at the corners, and she held it in front of her with both hands in the careful way that people hold things they cannot afford to lose. She looked around the restaurant slowly with tired eyes, as if she were looking for somewhere to sit. Or perhaps just somewhere to rest. She looked exhausted. She looked fragile. She looked in every possible way as if she did not belong in this room. And the room made sure she knew it. The silence stretched on for several uncomfortable seconds. Then all at once the whispers started. They moved around the dining room like a cold wind, quiet enough that the old woman could almost pretend she did not hear them, but loud enough that everyone else could. What is she doing here? Does she think this is a soup kitchen? Someone should call the manager. When did this place become a charity home? A woman at the table nearest the door leaned toward the man sitting across from her and said something behind her hand, and they both looked at the old woman and laughed, not loudly but in the way that is worse than loud, the quiet laugh that is meant to make someone feel small. A man near the window actually shifted in his chair so that his back was more fully turned toward the entrance. Another woman reached for her expensive handbag, which was sitting open on the empty chair beside her, and pulled it closer as if she needed to protect it. Naomi watched all of this from across the room, and she felt something tighten inside her chest. She had been about to walk back to the kitchen. Her hand was still on the water pitcher. But now she stood completely still, watching the old woman standing alone in the doorway with wet shoes and damp hair, being stared at and whispered about by a room full of people who had never known a day of real difficulty in their lives, and Naomi could not make herself move toward the kitchen. She could only watch. Then she saw him. Richard Coleman had noticed the old woman from the other side of the dining room, where he had been standing with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the floor the way he always did, not to make sure his staff were being treated well, but to make sure they were working hard enough and smiling wide enough and staying invisible enough to suit him. Richard was the general manager of Golden Ember, and he wore that title like armor. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a face that was handsome in a hard, cold way, and he dressed every evening in a dark suit that was pressed to perfection. He had worked in high-end restaurants for 15 years, and somewhere along the way he had decided that the most important thing in the world was the approval of wealthy people. Not kindness, not fairness, not dignity, approval, status. The feeling of belonging to the right rooms and keeping the wrong people out of them. When he saw the old woman, his jaw tightened, his eyes went cold, and he walked toward her. He crossed the dining room quickly, moving between the tables with long, purposeful strides, and the guests who saw him coming seemed to relax slightly, the way people relax when they believe someone is about to solve a problem for them. Richard reached the entrance in less than 10 seconds, and when he stopped in front of the old woman, he did not lower his voice. He did not try to be discreet. He drew himself up to his full height and spoke loudly enough for the nearest 3 tables to hear him clearly. "This restaurant," he said, with the flat, clipped tone of someone who has decided a conversation is already over before it begins, "is for paying customers. Not for homeless people." The old woman blinked. Her lips parted slightly and she began to say something. Her voice came out soft and a little shaky, the way voices do when they belong to someone who is trying very hard to hold themselves together. "I only wanted—" "I don't think you understand," Richard said, cutting her off cleanly. "This is a private dining establishment. Whatever it is you need, you will not find it here. I am going to have to ask you to leave." He said the last part the way you might say it to an insect you were directing toward an open window. Firm, final, completely without warmth. The old woman stopped speaking. Her hands tightened slightly on her cracked leather bag. She looked around the room once, just once, and in that single look, Naomi saw something that pierced straight through her heart. It was not anger. It was not even sadness exactly. It was the look of someone who has been reminded, once again, of exactly what the world thinks of them. A look of quiet, terrible recognition. Naomi put down the water pitcher. She was already moving before she had fully decided to move. She felt it in her legs before she felt it in her mind, that pull toward something that is right even when it is dangerous, that stubborn refusal to stand still in the face of cruelty just because it is easier and safer and smarter to stay out of it. Her hands were trembling slightly as she crossed the dining room. She could feel several pairs of eyes tracking her movement. She could feel, without looking at him, that Richard had already noticed her coming, and that his expression had shifted into something sharp and warning. She reached the old woman before Richard could say another word. "Ma'am," Naomi said, and her voice was gentle but steady. She turned slightly so that her body was angled between the old woman and the manager, not blocking him exactly, but creating just enough of a presence to slow the moment down. "Please come with me. I have a table for you right over here." Richard's voice came in immediately, low and dangerous. "Naomi." She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the old woman's face. "I will personally take care of this guest's meal tonight," Naomi said. She said it to Richard, but she kept her eyes on the old woman, on the quiet dignity that was still sitting in those tired eyes despite everything. "It will come out of my own pocket. There is no cost to the restaurant." The dining room, which had been whispering and rustling through this entire scene, went suddenly and completely quiet. Nobody moved. Richard's face had gone through 3 different expressions in about 2 seconds, and none of them were good. The customers nearest the entrance were watching with undisguised curiosity, their forks hovering halfway between plates and mouths, forgotten. Even the piano had reached one of its natural pauses between pieces, and for a moment the entire restaurant existed in a strange and suspended silence, as if the building itself were holding its breath. The old woman looked at Naomi. She looked at her the way you look at something you were not expecting and cannot quite believe. She looked at her carefully, the way you look at something you want to remember. Her eyes, dark brown and deep and older than anything else in the room, moved over Naomi's face slowly, and what was in them was not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was part of it. It was something bigger than gratitude. Something more solemn. Richard spoke again, very quietly, very carefully, in the voice he reserved for moments when he wanted to remind someone that they were making a very serious mistake. "We will discuss this later." Naomi heard him. She understood exactly what he meant. She knew what later looked like when Richard said it in that voice. But she stood where she was. She extended her hand gently toward the old woman, and after a moment, the old woman took it. Naomi led her to a small table near the wall, away from the worst of the staring, and pulled out the chair for her the same way she would have done for any other guest. She brought her water. She brought her a menu. She sat with her for just a moment and spoke to her quietly, asking what she would like. The old woman's voice was steadier now. Her shoulders, which had been hunched slightly toward her ears when she first walked in, had come down a little. Some of the terrible stiffness had left her face. She ordered a bowl of soup and a bread roll. Naomi went to the kitchen and placed the order herself, and she paid for it at the register from the thin fold of bills she kept in her apron pocket. $22. Nearly 2 hours of wages. She did not hesitate. When the soup came out and Naomi brought it to the table, the old woman looked up at her again with those deep, quiet eyes. A little while later, when the bowl was empty and the bread was gone and the old woman had rested enough to stand again, she put on her worn coat and picked up her cracked handbag and prepared to go back out into the rain. Naomi was there to help her with her chair. She walked with her toward the door, and just before the old woman stepped outside, she stopped. She turned back to Naomi. She reached out and took Naomi's hand in both of hers. Her hands were small and dry and very warm, and she held it for a moment without speaking. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, meant only for Naomi, close enough that Naomi could feel the warmth of each word. "One day, child," the old woman said, "your kindness will change your life forever." Then she released Naomi's hand, pushed open the door and walked back out into the rain. Naomi stood at the entrance and watched her go, feeling something she could not name moving through her chest. Something quiet and deep and strangely certain, the way you feel just before you understand something important that you cannot yet put into words. She did not know the old woman's name. She did not know where she had come from or where she was going. She did not know that in that moment, standing at the golden door of golden ember with wet footprints still drying on the marble behind her, something had shifted in the world in a way that would take a little time to reveal itself. But it had shifted. She just did not know it yet. Behind her, the dining room had already returned to its usual noise, the clinking glasses, the murmuring conversations, the quiet piano filling the air with something soft and forgettable. The guests had gone back to their meals and their important discussions, already losing interest in what had just happened the way people lose interest in things that do not concern them. The old woman was gone. The little drama at the entrance was over. Everything was back to normal. But not for Richard Coleman. Naomi felt him before she saw him. She turned from the door and he was already there, standing just a few feet away, his arms at his sides and his jaw set hard and his eyes fixed on her with the kind of stillness that is more frightening than shouting. He waited until a couple of nearby guests had looked away. Then he tilted his head very slightly toward the back of the restaurant, toward the kitchen doors, and that small movement was all he needed to say. Naomi followed him. The kitchen was loud and hot and smelled of garlic and butter and something sweet burning slightly at the edges of a pan. The cooks moved fast, calling out orders to each other, sliding plates across the stainless steel counters with practiced speed. Nobody looked up when Naomi and Richard walked in, partly because they were busy and partly because they had learned long ago that when Richard walked into the kitchen with that particular expression on his face, the safest thing to do was look somewhere else. He walked her to the far end of the kitchen, near the back wall where the noise from the dining room was muffled and the only sounds were the hiss of the stove and the rattle of pans, and then he turned to face her. He did not raise his voice. That was the thing about Richard that made him so effective and so frightening. He almost never shouted. He understood that quiet cruelty cuts deeper than loud cruelty, that a voice kept very low and very controlled in a moment of anger communicates something more dangerous than screaming ever could. "Do you have any idea," he said, each word coming out slow and deliberate, "what you just did out there?" Naomi kept her chin level. "I served a customer." "You embarrassed me," Richard said. The word came out like something hard hitting a hard surface. In front of a full dining room. In front of people who pay $500 for a table in this restaurant. You made a scene. You undermined my authority. And you invited a homeless woman to sit at one of my tables. She was not homeless, Naomi said. She was an elderly woman who came in from the rain. Something flickered in Richard's eyes. Not doubt. Something colder than doubt. That is not your decision to make. Your job is to serve the guests I tell you to serve at the tables I assign to you, in the manner I instruct. Your job is not to make decisions about who belongs in this restaurant. That is my job. Do you understand me? Naomi said nothing. Poor people, Richard continued, and his voice dropped even lower, do not belong in places like this. Not because I am a cruel man, but because this is how the world works. There are places for everyone. This is not her place. And it is not your place to decide otherwise. He paused, letting the silence sit between them like something heavy. If you ever do something like that again, if you ever contradict me in front of my customers or bring someone into this restaurant without my approval, or spend one more second making me look incompetent in front of people whose opinion matters, you will be finished here. Do you understand what I am telling you? Finished. He held her gaze for one more second, then turned and walked back toward the dining room doors without waiting for her response, because he was the kind of man who ended conversations by leaving them, knowing the other person had no choice but to stay behind and absorb what had just been said. Naomi stood at the back of the kitchen alone for a moment. She could feel the cooks carefully not looking at her. The heat from the stoves pressed against her face and her arms. She breathed in slowly through her nose and out through her mouth and told herself what she always told herself in moments like this one, that she needed this job. That Marcus needed his medication. That rent was due in 11 days. That she could not afford to break, so she would not break. She straightened her uniform and walked back out to the dining room. The rest of the evening passed the way difficult evenings pass, slowly and with too much to do, and with the knowledge of an unpleasant thing sitting quietly in the back of your mind while you try to concentrate on everything else. Naomi moved between tables, took orders, brought plates, smiled, refilled glasses, and said thank you to people who did not say it back, and she pushed the conversation with Richard into a corner of her mind where she would deal with it later, when she was home, when Marcus was asleep, when she could sit at the kitchen table and let herself feel it properly. Around 9:30, when the dinner rush had thinned out and only a few tables were still occupied, the only real moment of peace she had found all evening was interrupted. She was clearing plates from a table near the window, a table she had served earlier in the evening, occupied by a man in an expensive gray suit who had barely looked at her once during the entire meal, when she heard the voice. "Excuse me." She turned. The man in the gray suit was standing beside the table, and he was not looking at her the way customers usually look at waitresses when they want something. He was looking at her the way people look at other people when they are about to say something they have already decided cannot be argued with. "My watch," he said. "It's gone." Naomi looked at the table, then at the man. "I'm sorry?" "My watch." He held up his left wrist to show her the bare skin where a watch had apparently been. "It was on the table while I was eating. It's a gold watch. It cost $8,000. And now it is not there." Naomi felt a cold ripple move through her. "Sir, I haven't." "You were the one serving this table all evening," the man said. His voice was not raised. It was calm and certain and deeply unpleasant. "You were the only staff member who came to this table. I can assure you I did not take anything from." "What is the problem here?" Richard had appeared from nowhere, the way Richard always appeared when something was wrong, immediately, as if he had sensors tuned specifically to the frequency of trouble. He stood between Naomi and the customer, facing the customer with his best expression of concerned authority. The man in the gray suit explained, slowly, carefully, watching Richard's face as he spoke. And Richard turned to look at Naomi with an expression that she would remember for a very long time afterward, not because it was surprising, but because of how completely unsurprised it made her feel. It was the expression of a man who had already made up his mind and was simply waiting for the formalities to be completed before acting on what he had already decided. "Empty your pockets," Richard said. "Richard, empty your pockets, Naomi." "No." In front of everyone. The few remaining customers in the dining room had gone quiet again. Naomi looked around the room, at the faces turned toward her, curious and cold, already half convinced of something she had not done, and she felt that particular kind of humiliation that comes not just from being accused but from knowing that the accusation will be believed, because some people will always believe the worst about someone who looks like her and works a job like hers in a place like this. She turned her pockets out. The thin fold of bills she always kept for emergencies. A pen. A lip balm. A folded piece of paper with Marcus's medication schedule written on it in her own handwriting. No watch. Richard stared at her pockets for a moment. Then he looked at the customer. Then he looked back at Naomi, and something in his expression shifted, not into apology, but into a kind of cold recalibration, as if he were deciding what to do now that the easiest solution had not worked. "There may be other places you've put it," he said to Naomi. "Your bag. The staff room." "I did not take his watch," Naomi said. Her voice came out steady, and she was grateful for that because nothing in her body felt steady at that moment. "I have never taken anything in my life." "I'll be searching the staff room," Richard said as if she had not spoken. "And if I find anything, I will be calling the police." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. Naomi's heart dropped through the floor. She thought of Marcus. She thought of the medication. She thought of the 11 days until rent was due and the amount currently sitting in her bank account and what it would mean, what it would cost her. If Richard actually made that call and something happened to this job because of a lie told by a man in a gray suit who could not be bothered to look properly for his own property. She opened her mouth to speak again. She did not know what she was going to say, but she was going to say something, because staying quiet had never once made things better for her. When Richard's phone lit up in his hand, it was ringing. He glanced at the screen with the irritated expression of someone who is being interrupted at a critical moment, and he answered it. "Coleman," he said sharply. And then he went still. It happened so gradually and so completely that several people in the room noticed it without being able to explain exactly what they were seeing. The set of his shoulders changed first. The hard, forward lean of a man in complete control softened, almost imperceptibly, into something else, something smaller. Then his face changed. The color left it, moving outward from the center the way color moves out of something when the heat under it is removed, until his face was pale in a way that had nothing to do with lighting. His free hand, the one not holding the phone, dropped slowly to his side and then seemed to forget what hands are for, hanging there with the fingers slightly open. He did not speak for a long time. He only listened. Then he said very quietly, "Yes, ma'am." And then, after another long pause, "I understand." And then, "Yes. Right away." He lowered the phone from his ear. He looked at it for a moment, the way you look at an object that has just delivered news you were not prepared for. Then he looked up, and his eyes found Naomi, and what was in them was something she had genuinely never seen in Richard Coleman's eyes in all the months she had worked for him. It looked like fear. "There's been a misunderstanding," Richard said. His voice had lost its edges. He turned to the man in the gray suit and the calm certainty was completely gone from his voice, replaced by something thin and careful. "The watch has been found. It was located near the entrance. I apologize for the confusion." The man in the gray suit blinked, clearly thrown. "Found? Where exactly?" "Near the entrance," Richard repeated, in a tone that communicated very clearly that this was the version of events they were all going to agree on, and that the conversation was now over. He turned back to Naomi and he said, with the stiff, painful quality of a man performing an action that every muscle in his body is resisting, "I apologize, Naomi. The situation has been resolved." Naomi stood completely still. She looked at Richard. She looked at the phone still in his hand. She looked at the pale, frightened face of a man who, 3 minutes ago, had been about to call the police on her for something she had not done, and who was now apologizing to her in front of customers, and she understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that moved through her the way cold water moves through you when you drink it too fast, that something had happened on that phone call that had changed the temperature of the entire room. She did not know who had been on the other end of that call. But the old woman's words came back to her then, soft and certain, the way important things come back to you at the exact moment you need them. "One day, child, your kindness will change your life forever." Naomi said nothing more to Richard. She picked up the tray she had set down when the accusation started, and she walked back toward the kitchen, and she did not let herself think too hard about what any of it meant, because she had learned long ago that the middle of a busy dinner service was not the place to feel things. There would be time for that later. An older woman appeared beside her as she pushed through the kitchen door. Angela. She was 51 years old, had worked at Golden Ember for 9 years, and had the kind of face that had been kind for so long that kindness had become permanently written into the lines of it. She was the only staff member who had nodded at Naomi when she walked the old woman to her table earlier that evening, the only one who had not immediately looked away. "You did the right thing," Angela said quietly, moving alongside her toward the service station. "Earlier, with that woman. It was the right thing." "I know," Naomi said. "Richard knows it too," Angela added. "That's why it made him so angry." They did not say anything else about it. But Angela stayed near her for the rest of the shift, close enough that Naomi could feel it, the way you can feel warmth from something even when you are not directly touching it. The shift ended at 11:30. Naomi changed out of her uniform in the staff room, pulling on her regular coat and her worn trainers, and she took the bus home through the wet, quiet streets. The rain had stopped, but everything was still damp and gleaming under the street lights. She sat at the back of the bus with her bag on her lap and her head resting against the cool glass of the window, watching the city slide past. She thought about the old woman. About those warm, dry hands holding hers. About the way those deep brown eyes had looked at her, not with pity, not with gratitude exactly, but with something that felt like recognition. Like the old woman had seen something in Naomi that Naomi had not yet figured out how to see in herself. She thought about Richard's face on that phone call. The color draining out of it. The fear moving in. She thought about the name she had caught, barely at the edge of hearing when Richard's voice had gone so quiet and so careful. A name he had not said out loud but had repeated back in the way you repeat a name when you want to make sure you have heard it correctly. Brooks. She was almost certain that was what she had heard. Evelyn Brooks. She did not know that name. She turned it over in her mind on the bus ride home, the way you turn over a stone you have found on a path, looking at it from different angles, not sure yet what it is or why it feels important. She got home just before midnight. She checked on Marcus. He was asleep, his breathing slow and even, one hand curled under his cheek the way it had been since he was small. She stood in the doorway of his room for a moment, watching him sleep the way older sisters watch younger brothers sleep when they have been carrying the weight of worrying about them all day, and the sight of them resting peacefully is the only thing that makes the weight worth carrying. She went to the kitchen. She sat down at the small table. She counted what was left in her account after the $22 she had spent on the old woman's meal, and the numbers were as small as they always were, and she was as tired as she always was, and tomorrow she would wake up early and take the bus across the city and start all over again. But something was different tonight. Something small and quiet and impossible to name, sitting in her chest just beneath the tiredness. She did not know what it was yet. She only knew it was there. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. And the next morning her phone rang. She almost did not answer it. The number on the screen was one she did not recognize, long with a city code she could not place, coming in at 7:43 in the morning when she had only been awake for about 10 minutes and was still standing in the kitchen in her socks, waiting for the water in the small pot on the stove to boil for Marcus's oatmeal. She stared at the number for 2 rings, 3 rings, her thumb hovering over the screen, and then something, that same quiet pull she had felt the night before, that wordless instinct she had learned over 23 years to trust even when she could not explain it, made her press accept. Hello? Is this Naomi Carter? The voice on the other end was unlike any voice Naomi had heard directed at her in a very long time. It was a woman's voice, older, low and smooth and unhurried, carrying in it the particular kind of calm that belongs to people who have not needed to rush toward anything in many years because the world rearranges itself around them rather than the other way around. It was the voice of someone who was completely, absolutely certain that the call would be answered. Yes, Naomi said. This is Naomi. Good morning, Naomi. My name is Evelyn Brooks. I believe you and I have a mutual acquaintance from last night. The pot on the stove began to steam. Naomi reached over and turned the heat down without looking away from the window in front of her, her mind suddenly very alert and very still at the same time, the way your mind goes when something important begins happening and every part of you knows it. The woman from the restaurant, Naomi said quietly. That's right. A brief pause. I would very much like to meet with you today if you are available. There is a hotel called the Meridian on the north end of the business district. I will have a table reserved in the restaurant there for 11 o'clock. I hope you can come. Naomi looked around her small kitchen. At the pot of oatmeal. At the medication bottles lined up on the counter beside the sink. At the stack of bills she had been moving from one end of the table to the other for 2 weeks because she could not yet figure out the right order to pay them in. I can come, she said. Wonderful. The voice was warm, but it also carried something underneath the warmth, a kind of quiet weight, as if the simplest words this woman spoke arrived carrying more meaning than they appeared to on the surface. I look forward to meeting you properly, Naomi. And please, wear something that makes you feel like yourself. Not a uniform. The call ended. Naomi stood holding the phone against her palm for a long moment, looking at the blank screen. Then she stirred the oatmeal, made Marcus's breakfast, set it on his bedside table with his morning medication, and went to her small wardrobe to find something to wear. She did not own very many clothes that were not work clothes. Her wardrobe was mostly dark and practical, things chosen for durability and the ability to be washed many times without falling apart. But at the very back, pushed behind everything else, she found the navy blue dress she had bought 2 years ago for a job interview she had not gotten. It was simple and clean and fell just below the knee, and when she put it on and stood in front of the small mirror on the inside of the wardrobe door, she looked like herself, not the uniform version of herself, not the tired eyes and apron version, but something closer to the person she was on the inside, the one that the dining room of Golden Ember had never once bothered to look at. She wrote Marcus a note, told him she would be back by early afternoon, and took the bus across the city toward the business district. The Meridian was not a place Naomi had ever had reason to enter before. She had walked past it many times. It was one of those buildings that announces itself quietly but completely, a tall, pale stone structure with a wide revolving door and a long awning and doormen who wore dark uniforms and had the still, attentive posture of people who notice everything without appearing to notice anything. She pushed through the revolving door and stepped into the lobby and immediately felt the particular sensation of entering a space that was designed specifically to make certain kinds of people feel at home and certain other kinds of people feel as if they had wandered somewhere they did not belong. She was not going to let herself feel that. She straightened her back and walked toward the hotel restaurant the way she walked across the floor of Golden Ember during a dinner rush, with purpose, with quiet attention, with the dignity she carried everywhere she went even when it cost her something to carry it. The restaurant was through a set of tall glass doors off the main lobby. A host met her at the entrance, checked her name against something on a small tablet, and led her inside without hesitation. She saw the table immediately. It was in the center of the room, not pushed against a wall or hidden in a corner, but right in the middle where the light was best, where anyone entering would see it first. It was set for two, with white linen and crystal glasses and a small arrangement of pale flowers in the center. And sitting at it, perfectly still, perfectly composed, was a woman who stopped Naomi's feet for just a moment before she could make herself keep walking. Because it was the same woman. The same face, the same deep brown eyes, the same gray hair. But everything else, everything that had been worn and tired and damp the night before, had been replaced by something so completely different that for a fraction of a second Naomi's mind struggled to connect the two images into one person. She was wearing a dress the color of deep burgundy, tailored so precisely to her small frame that it looked as though it had been made specifically for her body and no other. Around her neck, a single strand of diamonds caught the light of the restaurant and threw it softly in every direction. Her hair, which had been flattened by the rain the night before, was now arranged beautifully, silver and elegant. Her posture was perfect. Shoulders back, chin level, hands folded in her lap. The posture of a woman who has spent decades knowing exactly who she is and never once apologizing for it. Her face was calm and warm and entirely, completely in command of the room around her, even though she was sitting perfectly still and not speaking to anyone. She saw Naomi coming and a smile moved across her face, genuine and slow, the kind that starts in the eyes before it reaches the mouth. "Naomi," she said, rising slightly as Naomi reached the table. "Please sit down. I am so glad you came." Naomi sat. For a moment she did not quite know where to put her hands. Then she folded them on the table in front of her the way she had seen composed people do in difficult situations, and she looked at the woman across from her and said, "Honestly, you look very different from last night." Evelyn Brooks looked at her for a moment with those quiet, measuring eyes, and then she laughed. It was a real laugh, warm and unguarded, the kind that comes from genuine surprise, and it made her look, for just a moment, younger than everything else about her suggested. "I imagine I do," she said. She settled back into her chair and reached for her water glass and took a small sip, and then she set it down and looked at Naomi with an expression that had shifted back into something more serious, more careful, as if she were choosing her next words the way you choose each step when you are crossing something uncertain. "I want to tell you who I am," Evelyn said. "And then I want to tell you why I was in that restaurant last night. And then I want to talk to you about something that I hope will matter to you. Is that all right?" "Yes," Naomi said. Evelyn nodded once. "My full name is Evelyn Marie Brooks. I am 71 years old. I grew up in a small apartment with my mother, my grandmother, and 3 younger siblings, in a part of the city where the streetlights were always broken and the landlord never answered the phone. We did not have very much. There were weeks when we had almost nothing." She paused, not for effect but the way people pause when they are touching something real. "I started working when I was 14, cleaning offices after school, then waitressing on weekends, then managing a small diner when I was 22, which was the first time anyone had ever given me real responsibility, and I held on to that responsibility with both hands and refused to let go of it." She looked at Naomi steadily. Naomi did not say anything. She only listened. "Over the next 40 years, Evelyn continued, I built something. Slowly. Sometimes painfully. I made mistakes and lost money and started over more times than I can easily count. But I built it." She reached for her water glass again, turned it slightly in her fingers without drinking. "Today I own 47 restaurants across this country. The group is called Brooks Dining Group. It has been valued, most recently, at just over $400 million. The number landed in the space between them quietly, without fanfare, which somehow made it land harder than if it had been announced. Naomi kept her face still, but something moved through her at hearing it. Not envy, nothing like envy, but a kind of awe that had nothing to do with the money itself and everything to do with the distance between a broken streetlight and $400 million, and what it must have taken to travel that distance. "Golden Ember," Evelyn said, and she watched Naomi's face carefully as she said it, "is one of mine." Naomi's breath caught very slightly. She controlled it quickly but not quickly enough, and Evelyn saw it and gave a small nod that acknowledged it without making too much of it. Richard Coleman has managed that location for 6 years, Evelyn said. In that time, the restaurant's revenue numbers have been excellent. His reviews from customers have been strong. On paper, he is exactly what a manager should be. Pause. But I have never trusted paper completely. Paper tells you what people do when they know they are being measured. It does not tell you who they are when they believe no one important is watching. She set the water glass down. Every year, Evelyn said, her voice becoming quieter, more deliberate, I choose one place, a restaurant I own or one I am considering purchasing, or sometimes simply a public place where people go about their lives, and I spend an evening there. Dressed as you saw me last night. No jewelry. No driver. No reservation made under my real name. Just an old woman in worn-out clothes stepping in from the rain. She looked at Naomi without blinking. I have done this for 11 years. I have walked into 31 different establishments, and in 31 different establishments, the result has been almost entirely the same. I have been ignored. I have been mocked. I have been turned away. I have been spoken to in ways that I will not repeat to you because they do not deserve to be repeated. She let a brief silence sit. People reveal themselves very completely when they believe the person in front of them has no power. What I see in those moments is more honest than anything a performance review or a revenue report could ever tell me. She stopped. The restaurant around them moved quietly, soft footsteps, the distant sound of something being said on a counter, a low conversation at a table far across the room. Last night, Evelyn said, was the first time in 11 years and 31 visits that someone stepped forward. Naomi looked at her. You were the only one, Evelyn said simply. In that entire room. Every customer, every member of staff. You were the only person who moved. She paused. And you paid for my meal out of your own pocket. A woman who, if I am not mistaken, cannot easily afford to do that. Naomi did not deny it. I want to ask you something, Evelyn said. And I want you to answer me honestly because I have spent 71 years learning to tell the difference between an honest answer and a performance, and I am very good at it now. She looked at Naomi steadily. Why did you do it? Not the polished answer. The real one. Naomi thought about it for a moment. Not because she did not know the answer, but because the answer was one she had never needed to put into words before, and she wanted to put it into the right ones. Because she was a person, Naomi said finally, and she was being treated like she wasn't. And I know what that feels like. And I couldn't stand there and let it keep happening just because standing there was easier. She paused. That's it. There isn't more to it than that. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. And then something shifted in her face, something that had been held very carefully in place, with the long practice of a woman who had learned to feel things privately, and her eyes grew bright in the way eyes grow bright when feeling moves through them faster than composure can manage. She reached across the table and covered Naomi's hand with hers, and her hand was exactly as warm as it had been the night before in the doorway of Golden Ember. You reminded me, Evelyn said, and her voice was lower now, closer, of who I was when I was your age. Before the money. Before the restaurants and the board meetings and the title. She stopped, steadied herself. I had a daughter. Her name was Claire. She died 8 years ago. She was 34. She did not look away from Naomi's face. She had your eyes. Not the color. The quality of them. The way they pay attention. Naomi felt something open in her chest. Something tender and unguarded and very old. The part of her that had grown up without anyone to be a parent to her. The part that had learned to be careful with hope because hope, in her experience, had a way of being taken back. I have been very successful, Evelyn said quietly. And I have been very lonely. And those two things are not as contradictory as people imagine. She straightened slightly, and when she spoke again her voice had recovered its composure, though the warmth in it was still there, fully present. I would like to offer you something, Naomi. And I want you to hear everything I have to say before you respond, because I want you to understand that what I am offering is not charity. It is not pity. It is an investment, in someone whose character I have assessed over the course of one evening and found to be worth more than most people I have encountered in 40 years of business. Naomi sat very still. I want to offer you a position in my organization, Evelyn said. Not a waitressing position. An executive development role, working directly with my operations team, learning how this business runs from the inside, with a salary that will allow you to pay your rent and care for your brother and still have something left over at the end of the month. She paused. I also want to pay for your continued education. Whatever you want to study. Business management, hospitality, anything. I will arrange it and I will fund it completely. And I want to be your mentor. Not in a formal, distant, once-a-month phone call way. I mean something real. Someone who is available to you. Someone who has been where you are standing right now and can help you see what is on the other side of it. She stopped and looked at Naomi and waited. Naomi looked down at the white tablecloth for a moment. She looked at the small arrangement of pale flowers. She thought about Marcus asleep in the apartment across the city, his medication lined up on the counter, the bills she had been shuffling from one end of the table to the other for 2 weeks. And then she thought about something else. Something that did not have anything to do with money or positions or salaries, something that lived in the part of her that was separate from all of that. She thought about the warmth in Evelyn's hand on hers. She thought about the way Evelyn had said the word daughter, the careful way she had held it as it came out, the way you hold something that is precious and also painful. She thought about her own mother, who had not been there, who had left when Marcus was 4 and Naomi was 8 and had not come back, and the particular shape of absence that had lived in Naomi ever since. She looked up. Her eyes were full, and she did not try to hide it, because there was something about this woman across the table that made pretending seem not just unnecessary but wrong. "Why are you being this kind to me?" she asked, and her voice was steady mostly, except for the very edge of it. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. "Because kindness," she said softly, "is the only currency that pays both people at once." And that was when Naomi Carter, who had not cried in front of another person in longer than she could remember, because crying in front of people was a luxury she had never been able to afford, felt the tears come, quietly, without drama, the way rain comes when it has been held back long enough that holding it back any longer is simply no longer possible. Evelyn did not look away. She did not offer a tissue or change the subject or perform the discomfort that most people perform when someone else's feelings become visible. She simply sat with it, the way someone sits with you in a difficult moment when they have known enough difficult moments themselves to understand that the most powerful thing you can offer is simply your presence. Unmoving, unhurried, certain. They sat together in that restaurant for 2 more hours. They talked, really talked, the way Naomi had not talked to another person in years, not since before Marcus got sick and the world had narrowed down to shifts in medication schedules and numbers that never quite added up. Evelyn told her about the early years of building the business, about the banks that had said no and the partners who had walked away and the nights she had sat alone in her car outside a restaurant that was failing and talked herself into going back inside and trying one more time. Naomi told her about Marcus, about the hospital visits and the treatments and the way she had learned to read medication labels the way other people her age were learning to read wine menus. She told her about the small kitchen table and the bills and the way she counted money at midnight and then went to bed and woke up and did it all over again. And Evelyn listened the way powerful people rarely listen. Completely, without interrupting, without redirecting the conversation toward herself, without offering solutions in the middle of sentences. She listened as if what Naomi was saying was the most important thing being said anywhere in the city at that moment. By the time they stood to leave, something had settled between them that was not yet named but was already real. Naomi understood, walking back through the hotel lobby and out through the revolving door into the cool morning air, that whatever this was, whatever had begun the night before in the doorway of Golden Ember with a warm hand holding hers and 6 quiet words, it was not simply a business arrangement. It was not simply an opportunity. It was something she did not have a word for yet, but that her body recognized the way your body recognizes warmth when you have been cold for a very long time. In the weeks that followed, things began to change. Naomi continued her shifts at Golden Ember while the paperwork and arrangements for her new role were being put in place, and during those weeks she saw Richard Coleman every day, moving through his restaurant with his usual authority, completely unaware that anything had shifted in the world around him. He was still sharp-tongued and status-obsessed, still walking the floor with his hands behind his back and his eyes tracking every table for anything that fell short of his standards. He had not apologized again for what had happened the night of the accusation. He had not mentioned it. He had simply moved forward, the way people move forward when they have been given no real reason to believe they will face consequences for anything. Naomi watched him. She said nothing. She did her job. Angela noticed the change in her. Not a dramatic change. Naomi had always been composed, always been steady, but something underneath the composure was different. Something had relaxed that had been tightly wound for a very long time. Angela pulled her aside one evening during a quiet moment between services and looked at her with the kind of eyes that have been paying attention for 9 years and miss very little. "Something happened," Angela said. It was not a question. "Something happened," Naomi agreed. Angela nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they are not entirely sure what they are nodding about but trust the person they are nodding at. Meanwhile, across the city, in an office on the 38th floor of a glass building that looked out over the whole downtown, Evelyn Brooks was making calls and signing documents and setting things into motion with the quiet, unhurried efficiency of a woman who had spent 4 decades learning that the most powerful moves are always the ones the other side does not see coming. And then one morning, about 3 weeks after their first meeting at the Meridian, Evelyn called Naomi again. "I want to take you to dinner," she said. Naomi felt something tighten pleasantly in her chest. The warmth she had started to associate with Evelyn's calls, the warmth of being thought of, which was still new enough that it surprised her each time. "Of course," she said. "Where?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and when Evelyn spoke again her voice carried a particular quality that Naomi had come to recognize, the careful, almost amused quality of someone who is about to say something simple that contains something much larger inside it. "Golden Ember," Evelyn said. Naomi went still. "This Friday evening," Evelyn continued, "I've arranged a private dinner. Richard believes he is hosting an important investor. He has no idea who is coming." Another pause. "And Naomi, I want you with me. Not in your uniform. Not as a member of staff." Naomi swallowed. "As what?" She could hear the smile in Evelyn's voice when she answered, low and warm and completely certain. "This time, my child," Evelyn said, "you will not enter through those doors as a waitress. You will enter as someone they must respect." Naomi stood in her small kitchen, holding the phone with both hands, feeling the words settle into her the way important things settle. Slowly, completely, changing the shape of the space they land in. And she understood, without being told anything more, that Friday night was not simply a dinner. It was something that had been a long time coming. Friday arrived the way important days always arrive. Quietly, without announcement, looking from the outside exactly like any other day. The sun came up the same way it always did. The buses ran their usual routes. The city went about its business with the indifference that cities have always had toward the private turning points happening inside the lives of the people moving through them. But for Naomi Carter, this Friday was unlike any day she had lived before. She was up before 6. She sat with Marcus at the kitchen table while he ate his breakfast, and she told him she had somewhere important to be that evening, and he looked at her across the table with the particular sharpness that sick people sometimes have, the way illness strips away everything unnecessary and leaves only attention, and he said, "You seem different lately, Naomi. Like something good is happening." She looked at her younger brother. At his thin face and his careful eyes and the way he held his spoon with slightly unsteady hands because of the medication. She thought about how long she had been carrying the weight of his care alone, in the dark, without anyone to share it with. She thought about the conversation she had had with Evelyn the previous week, when Evelyn had asked her very directly about Marcus's condition and his treatment, and had listened to everything Naomi said with complete attention, and had then said equally directly that she knew 3 of the best specialists in the country for his condition and that cost would not be a factor. "Something good is happening," Naomi told him. "I'll tell you everything when I get home tonight." He smiled. It was the best smile she had seen on his face in months. She spent the morning doing ordinary things, laundry, groceries, making sure Marcus had everything he needed for the day. In the afternoon, she sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the navy blue dress she had worn to the Meridian, and then she thought about what Evelyn had said. "You will enter as someone they must respect." She thought about what that meant and what it required, and then she called Evelyn. "I don't know what to wear," she said. It was a simple, honest thing to say, and she said it simply and honestly, the way she had learned to say everything to Evelyn. There was a warm pause. "I had a feeling you might say that," Evelyn said. "There is a package being delivered to your address this afternoon. It should arrive within the hour." Naomi opened her mouth to protest and then closed it again. She had been learning, over the past 3 weeks, that protesting Evelyn's generosity was like arguing with the weather, not because Evelyn was forceful or domineering about it, but because it came from a place so genuine and so settled that resistance simply had nowhere to grip. The package arrived at 2:30. It was a large, flat box, cream-colored, with a ribbon. Inside, wrapped in layers of soft tissue paper, was a dress the color of midnight, deep blue-black, simple in its cut, with a quietly perfect elegance that Naomi had never owned anything close to before. With it was a pair of shoes, low-heeled and beautifully made, and a small note in Evelyn's handwriting that said only, "You have always had the grace. Now you have the dress to match it." Naomi sat on the bed for a long time holding the note. Then she got up and got ready. At 7:45 that evening, a long black car moved through the downtown streets in the early dark, its headlights cutting through the thin evening mist that had settled over the city after the sun went down. Inside, Naomi sat beside Evelyn, and Evelyn was wearing deep burgundy again, a different dress but the same quiet authority, and between them the conversation had wound down into a comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only exists between people who have already said enough important things to each other that silence no longer needs to be filled. Naomi looked out the window at the streets passing by. She recognized them. She had walked these streets in her work shoes at the end of late shifts, waiting for the night bus, too tired to think about anything but getting home. She had passed these same buildings and these same lit windows and these same golden restaurant doors and felt each time the particular loneliness of being on the outside of something warm. Tonight she was on the inside of the car. "Are you nervous?" Evelyn asked. "Yes," Naomi said. She had stopped pretending otherwise with Evelyn weeks ago. Evelyn nodded. "Good," she said. "Nervous means it matters. People who feel nothing before important moments are people who have stopped caring about outcomes." She paused. "Just remember who you are. Not who they made you feel like you were. Who you actually are." The car slowed. Through the window, Naomi saw it, golden ember, exactly as she had seen it hundreds of times before, glowing warm and gold against the dark. The chandeliers visible through the tall windows. The piano music she could almost hear even from inside the car. The man in the black suit at the front door. But something was different. She could see it even from outside. Through the windows, the staff was moving with a particular intensity, sharper, faster, more anxious than the usual dinner rush. Tables were being given last-minute adjustments. Glasses were being polished and repolished. A young busboy near the window was straightening a napkin fold with the focused expression of someone who had been told twice already that it was not straight enough. She knew what that looked like. She had been one of those people. She knew exactly who was responsible for the tension visible on every face inside that restaurant. Richard Coleman was preparing for the most important guest he had ever hosted. He just did not know who that guest actually was. The car came to a complete stop at the curb. The driver stepped out and came around to open the door, and Evelyn touched Naomi's arm gently. "Ready?" she said. Naomi looked at the door of golden ember one more time. She thought about the first time she had pushed through those doors in her uniform, nervous about making mistakes. She thought about the night she had carried trays across that polished floor for 12 hours with aching feet. She thought about standing in the kitchen at the back wall while Richard told her that poor people have their place and this was not it. She thought about the night she had turned her pockets inside out in front of customers who had already decided she was guilty. And then she thought about an old woman in a worn coat, standing in the rain-wet doorway, and 2 warm hands holding hers, and 6 words that had turned out to be the truest thing anyone had ever said to her. She looked at Evelyn. "Ready?" she said. The driver opened the door. Naomi stepped out first. The night air was cool and clean against her face. She straightened to her full height, and the midnight blue dress moved perfectly, and her feet were steady on the pavement, and she looked at the entrance of golden ember with the calm, open expression of someone who knows exactly where they are going and exactly why. Inside the restaurant, someone near the front window saw the car first. Then someone else. Within seconds, 4 or 5 staff members had drifted toward the windows with the barely concealed curiosity of people who have been told something important is happening tonight but have not been told what. They looked out at the long black car. They looked at the figure standing on the pavement outside. One of the younger waitresses, a girl named Diane who had started 3 months after Naomi, pressed closer to the glass and then pulled back suddenly, her face doing something complicated. "Is that?" she started. She did not finish the sentence because the answer was already walking toward the door. It was Naomi. But it was a version of Naomi that none of them had seen before, and the distance between the version they knew and the version now crossing the pavement toward the entrance was wide enough to stop every conversation within 10 feet of the window. She moved differently. Not because she was performing anything, Naomi had never been a performer, but because something inside her had settled into place over the past 3 weeks. Something that had always been there but had been pressed down under the weight of struggle and exhaustion and being treated as invisible for so long. It had been given room to stand up straight. And standing up straight, it turned out, changed everything about how a person moved through the world. Then the second door opened on the far side of the car, and Evelyn stepped out. Inside the restaurant, the man who saw her first was a waiter named Thomas who had been at Golden Ember for 4 years and had a good memory for faces. He saw the elderly woman in the deep burgundy dress step out of the car with the diamond necklace catching the light above the entrance awning, and something in the back of his memory stirred, something from 3 weeks ago, a rainy Thursday, an old woman in a worn coat, and his face went slowly and completely pale. He turned from the window and looked across the dining room to where Richard Coleman was standing, doing a final inspection of the reserved table in the center of the room. "Mr. Coleman," Thomas said. His voice came out strange. Richard did not look up from the table immediately. He adjusted a fork. "What is it?" I think you should look outside." Something in Thomas's voice made Richard look up. He crossed to the window. He looked out. He saw the car first, then Naomi, and his expression moved through confusion into something sharper, something not yet fully formed. Then he saw the woman standing beside her, and the confusion finished resolving itself into something else entirely. Richard Coleman had a very good memory for faces too. The color left his face the same way it had left his face 3 weeks ago on the phone call, gradually, completely, as if something underneath his skin had been switched off. His jaw did not tighten this time. It went slack. His hands, which had been clasped behind his back in his usual stance, came slowly apart and fell to his sides. He stood at the window and watched the two women walk toward the entrance of his restaurant, and for the first time in the 6 years he had managed Golden Ember, Richard Coleman looked genuinely, deeply afraid. He turned from the window and straightened his jacket and walked toward the entrance with the stiff, over-controlled movements of a man trying very hard to appear to be in command of a situation that is in fact completely beyond his control. The front door opened. The man in the black suit at the entrance held it wide, and Naomi walked through first, and then Evelyn, and the warmth and the piano music and the light of the chandeliers received them both. Every head in the restaurant turned. The dining room went through its now familiar hush, that spreading quiet that moved from the front tables toward the back like a current. But this time it was different from the quiet that had greeted an old woman in a wet coat 3 weeks ago. This time it was the quiet of people who are trying to understand what they are seeing and cannot quite manage it, because what they are seeing does not fit into any category they have prepared. Richard arrived in front of them. He smiled. It was the smile of someone whose face has forgotten what smiling actually feels like and is doing its best to approximate it from memory. "Good evening," he said. His voice was careful and perfectly controlled. "Welcome to Golden Ember. We are so honored to have you with us tonight." He looked at Evelyn as he said this, with the full attention of a man who understood who the important person was and was directing all of his performance at her. Then his eyes moved, briefly and involuntarily, to Naomi. Something passed through them. Something that was not quite shame and not quite fear and not quite recognition, but contained pieces of all three. Naomi looked back at him steadily and said nothing. Evelyn said pleasantly, "Thank you, Richard. I believe you have a table for us." "Of course. Right this way." He led them to the center table. The best table, the table he had reserved and prepared and had polished and repolished all afternoon. He pulled out Evelyn's chair himself. He snapped his fingers for water. He hovered nearby with the attentiveness of a man who has understood very clearly that this evening is a test he cannot afford to fail. Evelyn settled into her chair and looked around the dining room slowly, taking in all of it. The chandeliers, the polished floors, the piano, the careful faces of the staff moving between tables. She looked at it all with the calm, assessing eyes of someone taking stock of something that belongs to her, which Naomi realized was exactly what she was doing. Then she looked at Richard, who was standing nearby with his hands clasped and his smile fixed. "Richard," she said pleasantly, "I would like the bread brought out immediately, and I would like you to personally oversee it. Not the kitchen staff. You." Something flickered behind his eyes. "Of course. And Richard, when the bread comes, I want you to bring it yourself. Not someone else. You." He nodded and moved toward the kitchen, and the moment he was through the doors, a young waiter near the service station turned slightly away and pressed his lips together to control an expression that was trying very hard to become a smile. Naomi saw it. She felt it, the quiet electric undercurrent moving through the staff, the barely suppressed satisfaction of people who had been living under a tyrant's authority for too long and were now watching that authority begin, slowly and publicly, to come apart. The dinner proceeded. Richard brought the bread himself, setting it on the table with careful hands. Evelyn pointed out that one of the rolls was slightly less warm than the others and asked him to have it replaced. He replaced it. She asked him to ensure the butter was properly softened. He checked. She asked him, at one point, to straighten the flower arrangement at the center of the table, which was already straight, and he straightened it anyway, leaning over the table with the stiff, concentrated effort of a man who has spent years making other people feel small and is now experiencing, with the full sensitivity of someone to whom this is completely new, what it feels like to be on the other side. The staff watched. They kept their faces professional because they were good at their jobs, but the atmosphere in the restaurant had changed in a way that everyone could feel, guests included, though they could not have said exactly what was different, only that the energy of the room was charged with something. Evelyn did not raise her voice once. She did not insult Richard directly. She did not say a single thing that could not, on the surface, be interpreted as the reasonable requests of a particular dinner guest. But the effect of each request was the same, to make absolutely clear to everyone in the room that the man who had spent 6 years walking this floor like he owned it was tonight walking it as something else entirely. Naomi ate her meal and watched and felt, moving through her quietly and steadily, the deep, cleansing satisfaction of a wrong thing being made right. At one point, midway through the main course, Evelyn looked across at her and said softly, just for the two of them, "How are you feeling?" "Strange," Naomi said honestly. "Strange and okay. Both at the same time." Evelyn nodded as if that was exactly the right answer. When the dessert plates had been cleared and the last of the coffee had been poured, and the dining room around them had thinned down to only a few remaining tables, Evelyn set down her cup and looked across the room to where Richard was standing near the service station. "Richard," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried clearly in the quieter room. "Please come here." He came. He stood at the edge of the table with his hands clasped and his face composed and his eyes doing the careful, watchful thing that eyes do when the person behind them is very frightened but is trying not to show it. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment without speaking. The silence was not uncomfortable for her. It was very uncomfortable for him. His clasped hands tightened slightly. "Do you know who I am?" Evelyn asked. "You are Evelyn Brooks," he said carefully. "You are an important investor in the—" "I am not an investor," Evelyn said. Her voice was calm and pleasant and absolutely without warmth now. "I am the owner of this restaurant, of this building, of the entire Brooks dining group, which includes this location and 46 others. Everything in this room, the chandeliers, the tablecloths, the piano, the kitchen equipment, the lease on this property, belongs to me." She paused. "And your position here, Richard, belongs to me as well." The remaining staff in the dining room had gone completely still. A young woman near the kitchen doors had stopped moving entirely, a clean towel held in both hands, forgotten. Thomas was standing at the service station with his eyes carefully forward, the way soldiers stand when something important is happening that they are not meant to react to but cannot help noticing. Angela, who had come in for the late shift and had been standing quietly near the back of the room for the past 20 minutes, was watching with the still, attentive expression of someone witnessing something they had been waiting a long time to see. Richard's face had stopped trying to hold its expression together. It was doing something more complicated now, something that moved between the remains of his professional composure and the rawness underneath it, the panic that had nowhere left to hide. "I want to tell you something," Evelyn said. She leaned forward very slightly. 3 weeks ago I walked into your restaurant. I was wearing old clothes. My shoes were wet from the rain. I came in from the cold to sit down." She did not blink. "Do you remember what you said to me?" He said nothing. His jaw worked once, silently. "You said," Evelyn continued, her voice still perfectly level, still perfectly pleasant as if she were discussing the menu, "that this restaurant is for paying customers, not for homeless people." She let the sentence sit in the air between them for a moment. "You said it loudly, in front of a full dining room, to a tired, elderly woman who had done nothing to you and nothing to anyone in this room." The silence in the restaurant was absolute. "I have been in this business for 40 years, Evelyn said. "I have met many people like you, Richard. People who are extremely capable when it comes to numbers and management and presentation. People who are very good at performing excellence for the people they believe matter. And people who are cruel without hesitation to everyone else." She paused. "The cruelty is not incidental to the performance. It is the other side of it. You cannot be genuinely kind and also do what you did that evening. Those two things cannot live in the same person." Richard's hands came apart from their clasp. One of them moved to his side. The other pressed flat against the table briefly and then withdrew. He looked, in this moment, like a man who is realizing, fully, finally, without any remaining space for doubt, that a thing he did has caught up with him. "And then," Evelyn said, "you accused a young woman who had worked faithfully in this restaurant for 2 years of stealing an $8,000 watch. Without evidence. In front of customers. Because it was easy, and because you could, and because you had spent so long in a position of power over people who had no power to push back that the thought that there might be consequences had simply stopped occurring to you." She looked at Naomi. A brief, gentle look. Then back at Richard. "She had done nothing wrong," Evelyn said. "She had done the only right thing in the room that evening. And you punished her for it." Richard opened his mouth. Something that might have been the beginning of an explanation or a justification or a defense started to form there. And then it did not come. Because whatever he had been going to say, he could see on Evelyn's face that there was no version of it that would change anything, and the understanding of that, the full, complete, irrevocable understanding, hit him all at once. He moved. It happened suddenly, the way things collapse when they have been under too much pressure for too long, not slowly and then quickly but all at once. His knees bent. He went down. He was kneeling on the polished marble floor of golden ember, in front of the table, his composure completely gone, his hands pressed together in a gesture that looked like the physical form of a thing he did not know how to say out loud. "Please," he said. His voice had lost everything that had ever made it frightening. It was just a voice now. "I am sorry. I am genuinely sorry. I know I went too far. I know what I said to that woman was wrong. I know what I did to Naomi was wrong. Please, I have a family. I have been here 6 years. Please, I am begging you." Evelyn looked at him on the floor for a long, quiet moment. When she spoke, her voice was not unkind. It was something worse than unkind. It was clear. "You are not sorry because you hurt someone," she said. "You are sorry because you hurt someone powerful." The sentence landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. Naomi felt it move through her completely because it was true, not just about Richard but about the entire shape of a world that had always treated kindness as weakness and power as permission. Richard stayed on the floor. His head dropped. "Stand up, Richard," Evelyn said. He stood. His face was wet at the corners of his eyes. He did not bother trying to hide it. "You are dismissed," Evelyn said simply. "Effective tonight. You will receive what you are contractually owed and nothing beyond it. I will also be contacting the industry network I am part of, because I will not allow the next group of employees at the next restaurant to endure what the people in this building have endured." She folded her hands on the table. "You may go." He went. The sound of his footsteps crossing the marble floor, the same floor he had walked for 6 years as if it belonged to him, which it had always in fact belonged to someone else, faded toward the back of the restaurant and then disappeared through the staff door. The dining room was perfectly silent. And then Evelyn turned. She looked across the room at the staff, at Thomas and Diane and the young busboy whose name was Kevin and the woman with the clean towel in her hands whose name was Priya and all the others who were standing in various positions around the room, still and wide-eyed and not yet sure what to do with what they had just witnessed. And at Angela, near the back, whose face had finally allowed itself to show what it had been holding all evening, something that was pure and complicated and looked very much like relief. Evelyn spoke to all of them. "My name is Evelyn Brooks," she said. "I own this restaurant. I want you to know that what you witnessed tonight is not the end of anything except one man's abuse of a position he did not deserve." She paused. "You deserve better than what you have been given here. You are going to get it." Then she looked at Naomi. And Naomi felt it coming, felt it in the way Evelyn's eyes settled on her, in the way the room seemed to reorganize itself subtly around that gaze, and she sat up very straight in her chair. "This restaurant," Evelyn said, still looking at Naomi but speaking now to the whole room, "needs a new general manager. Someone who understands this floor. Someone who knows what it costs to stand on it for 12 hours and still treat every person who walks through that door as if they matter. Someone who has already proven, under the worst possible pressure, that her character does not change based on who is watching." She paused. "Naomi Carter will be the new general manager of Golden Ember, effective immediately." The room erupted. Not with applause exactly, it was too shocked and too full for something as simple as applause. It was a sound made of many things at once, surprise and relief and joy and the specific, overwhelming emotion of watching something deeply unfair be made right in real time. Diane pressed both hands over her mouth. Kevin made a sound that was half laugh and half something else. Thomas closed his eyes for one brief second and when he opened them they were bright. And Angela, steady, quiet, 9 years of faithful service Angela, put her face in her hands and cried. Not loudly. Just the quiet, shaking kind of crying that happens when you have been holding something together for a very long time and the reason to keep holding it together has finally gone. Naomi sat at the center table in the midnight blue dress, and she looked around at all of it, at the faces and the chandeliers and the polished floors and the piano that had started playing again softly in the corner as if the world were simply continuing as it always does, and she felt something settle inside her that was so large and so complete that she did not have a word for it yet. She thought she might need to live with it for a while before she could name it. She looked at Evelyn. Evelyn was watching her with those deep, quiet eyes, and what was in them was something that Naomi recognized now. Something she had seen growing there over the weeks of their meetings and their conversations and their shared silences. It was the look of someone who has found something they did not dare to hope for. Naomi reached across the table and took Evelyn's hand. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Naomi said quietly, "Thank you." And Evelyn said just as quietly, "No, my child. Thank you." In the days that followed, Naomi stepped into her new role with the same steadiness she had brought to every difficult thing her life had asked of her, carefully, completely, without pretending it was easy and without allowing it to be harder than it needed to be. Her first morning as general manager, she gathered the entire staff before the lunch service and stood in front of them in the dining room she had crossed 1,000 times as a waitress, and she spoke to them simply and directly. "I know what it is like to work in a place where you are afraid to make a mistake," she said. "I know what it is like to feel invisible. I know what it is like to do your job with your whole self and have no one see it." She looked around at their faces, at Thomas and Diane and Kevin and Priya and all the others. "That is over. This is going to be a place where you are seen, where you are treated fairly, where you can do your work with dignity and go home at the end of the night feeling like your day meant something. That is not a luxury. That is the minimum. And I am going to make sure you have it." No one spoke. But the quality of the silence in the room was different from every silence that had existed in that restaurant before. Not the silence of people who are afraid, but the silence of people who are listening because what is being said matters to them. Then Naomi looked at Angela. "Angela," she said, "I want you to be my deputy, my second in command. No one in this building knows it better than you, and no one in this building has shown more quiet courage than you have. This restaurant needs your wisdom as much as it needs anything else." Angela pressed her lips together very hard. She nodded once, firmly, the way people nod when they do not trust their voice to stay steady. Then she straightened, and something happened in her posture that was the same thing that had happened in Naomi's, something long pressed down finally being given room to stand. The changes came steadily after that. Menus were reviewed. Scheduling was made fairer. A staff meal was introduced before every service, something Naomi had always believed in, the idea that people could not be expected to serve food with warmth when they were hungry themselves. A proper complaint process was established, not just for customers but for staff. The culture of the restaurant began, slowly and then more quickly, to transform, not because Naomi issued rules and demanded compliance, but because she modeled something, every day in every interaction, that people recognized as real and found themselves wanting to be near. The customers felt it too, though most of them could not have said what was different, only that Golden Ember felt different now. Warmer, somehow more alive, as if the building itself had relaxed. And beyond the restaurant, something larger was being built. Evelyn had been working, through the weeks of Naomi's transition into her new role, on something she had been thinking about for a long time. A foundation, formally established and properly funded, that would do in an organized and lasting way what Naomi had done instinctively on one rainy Thursday evening. It would provide hot meals to elderly residents throughout the city who could not easily access food. It would support families experiencing homelessness with not just food but dignity, proper table service, real plates, the full experience of being cared for rather than processed. It would be funded through a portion of the profits from the Brooks Dining Group and administered by a small team that Evelyn intended to build carefully. She asked Naomi to lead it alongside her. They named it the Claire Brooks Foundation after Evelyn's daughter. On the evening of the foundation's first event, a dinner held in the private dining room of Golden Ember for 80 elderly residents from across the city, served by the full restaurant staff on their best tablecloths with the piano playing and the chandeliers lit, Naomi stood at the back of the room and watched. She watched an old man in a threadbare jacket unfold a white linen napkin with shaking hands and lay it across his lap with a careful dignity that broke something open in her chest. She watched a woman with a walking stick accept a glass of water from Thomas, who had pressed his face pale against the window 3 weeks ago, and say thank you, and Thomas say you are very welcome ma'am, and mean it completely. She watched all of it and felt the particular fullness of a moment that you understand, even while you are inside it, will be one of the ones you remember for the rest of your life. Evelyn appeared beside her. They stood together at the back of the room, shoulder to shoulder, watching the dinner unfold in front of them. "Marcus called me today," Evelyn said quietly after a while. Naomi turned to look at her. "He did. He wanted to thank me. For the specialist." Evelyn's voice was soft. "He said the new treatment is working. That he feels better than he has in months." Naomi looked away for a moment, toward the chandeliers, and blinked several times. "He didn't tell me he was going to call you." "No," Evelyn said, and there was a smile in her voice. "He is very much his own person, your brother." "He is," Naomi agreed. They were quiet for a moment, comfortable in it, the way they had become comfortable in many things together over the weeks of building this new shape of life. "Evelyn," Naomi said. "Yes. That night, when you walked in from the rain." She paused, finding the words carefully. "Did you really not know what was going to happen? When you do those visits, do you go in hoping someone will be kind? Or have you stopped hoping by now?" Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the sound of the dinner, quiet conversation, the soft clink of cutlery, the piano, continued its warm and steady presence. "I go in hoping," Evelyn said finally. "Every time. I have always gone in hoping. Because the alternative, going in having already decided that people will fail you, is a way of being in the world that I refuse to accept." She paused. "Most times, it is a hope that does not get answered. But I keep bringing it." She turned to look at Naomi. "And then one evening, a young woman puts down a water pitcher and walks across a room. And the hope turns out to have been exactly the right thing to bring." Naomi looked at her. This woman who had built an empire from a broken streetlight and a refusal to give up. This woman who had lost a daughter and chosen, rather than letting the loss close her, to stay open. This woman who had walked into a cold and cruel room in wet shoes, carrying nothing but a test that most of the world had failed, and had waited patiently and hopefully for someone to pass it. She felt the truth of it, the whole story from the rainy doorway to this warm chandelier-lit room, settle into her like something that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. That kindness is not a small thing. That it costs something real, and the cost is what makes it matter. That a single moment of choosing to do the right thing instead of the easy thing can be, if the conditions are right and if the universe is paying attention, the first step of a journey that changes the entire shape of a life. Her life. She thought about the girl she had been 1 month ago, exhausted, counting money at a kitchen table at midnight, carrying everything alone. She thought about what it had cost her to walk across that dining room floor and stand between an old woman and a man with power. $22 and a job that had felt, in that moment, too important to risk. She had spent both without fully deciding to, because something in her had simply refused to stand still in the face of cruelty, and that refusal had been the most expensive and most important thing she had ever done. And the return on it was everything. Her brother getting better. Her work meaningful. Her life expanding into a shape she had never dared to imagine. And beside her, this woman. This extraordinary, complicated, generous, lonely, hopeful woman who had walked in from the rain looking for something the world had almost made her stop believing in. They had both found what they were looking for. Naomi reached out and took Evelyn's hand, the way Evelyn had taken hers that first night in the doorway. And they stood together at the back of the warm room, watching 80 people who the world had made to feel invisible sit at white tablecloth tables under crystal chandeliers and be served with dignity and warmth. And the piano played something soft and unhurried, and outside the city went on about its business, entirely unaware that in this one golden room, something true and important was happening. Something that had started with a rainy night, and a worn coat, and a water pitcher set down on a table, and one young woman who had decided, quietly at some cost, with trembling hands, that kindness was worth it. It always had been. And now the whole world inside that room knew it too. I hope you enjoyed watching this story as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, subscribe, and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in the next one.